The air in the Culver City studio tasted of sweat and cheap cigar smoke. A loaded revolver sat heavy in the gangster's overcoat. He came to break a man, to make a Hollywood golden boy bleed. 3 seconds later, the gangster was on the floor, fighting for his next breath. Los Angeles in the late 1960s was a city of profound contrasts. Underneath the glittering veneer of Hollywood's golden sunset lay a gritty, opportunistic underbelly. It was an era where studio bosses shook hands with syndicated mobsters, and protection was a commodity sold at the barrel of a gun. In this volatile mix, a young philosopher and martial artist was quietly revolutionizing the way the world understood combat. His name was Bruce Lee. Before the global superstardom, before the legend was immortalized in celluloid, Bruce was a private instructor to the elite. His studio was a sanctuary of discipline, tucked away from the prying eyes of the press. On a humid Tuesday afternoon, Bruce was working with one of his most dedicated students, the acclaimed actor James Coburn. Coburn, towering and athletic, was sweating profusely, trying to grasp the explosive mechanics of Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. "You are anticipating, James," Bruce said softly, his voice carrying a calm but unyielding authority. "Do not think about the strike. If you think, you are late. When the water hits the rock, it does not plan its course around it. It simply flows." While Bruce was distilling centuries of combat into fluid biomechanics, a different kind of force was making its way toward the studio. Victor Sterling was not a man of philosophy. He was a man of blunt, brutal leverage. Operating out of the shadows of the San Fernando Valley, Victor was a high-level enforcer and extortionist. He made his living shaking down independent business owners, rogue producers, and anyone who operated outside the protective umbrella of the major syndicates. Victor was a terrifying figure. Dressed in immaculately tailored suits that hid a thickly muscled frame built from years of street brawls in Chicago, he carried an aura of absolute violence. He didn't respect martial arts. To Victor, men who wore silk pajamas and kicked the air were nothing more than circus performers. Violence, in his world, was a crowbar to the kneecap in a dark alley, or a snub-nosed .38 pressed against the temple of a weeping victim. Victor's interest in Bruce Lee was not accidental. The underlying twist of this confrontation was orchestrated by a jealous rival. Arthur Pendleton, a prominent figure in the local martial arts community, had been hemorrhaging students. Hollywood executives, stunt coordinators, and dedicated fighters were abandoning Pendleton's traditional, rigid dojo to train with the charismatic Bruce Lee. Humiliated and desperate, Arthur had reached out to his underground connections, paying Victor Sterling a handsome sum to discourage Bruce from teaching in Los Angeles. The contract was simple: break the golden boy's confidence, break a few of his bones, and shut the studio down. Accompanying Victor was his right-hand man, Desmond Hayes. Desmond was a towering slab of a man, an ex-heavyweight boxer who had been permanently banned from the ring for nearly beating a referee to death. Desmond rarely spoke. He simply destroyed whatever Victor pointed him at. As Victor's black Lincoln Continental pulled up to the curb outside the Culver City studio, the enforcer lit a thick Cuban cigar. The sweet, acrid smoke filled the cabin. He checked the weight of the revolver resting in his shoulder holster. "We keep it quick," Victor growled to Desmond, exhaling a plume of blue smoke. "We walk in. We make it clear who owns the block. If Kato wants to do some gymnastics, you put him on the ground. Break his hands. A dancer can't dance without his feet, and a fighter can't teach with shattered fingers." Desmond merely cracked his knuckles, the sound like dry branches snapping in the quiet car. Inside the studio, the rhythmic slapping of bare feet on the hardwood floor suddenly halted. Bruce, holding a focus mitt for Coburn, tilted his head. His heightened senses, honed through decades of hypervigilance, picked up the heavy, uncoordinated footsteps echoing down the hallway. It was an erratic rhythm, heavy with arrogant intent. It did not belong to a student. "Take a break, James," Bruce said quietly, lowering the mitt. "We just got started, Bruce." "I'm finding the rhythm," Coburn replied, wiping his brow with a towel. "The rhythm has changed," Bruce noted, his dark eyes locked onto the frosted glass of the studio's front door. The door didn't just open, it was shoved inward with violent force, slamming against the plaster wall. Victor Sterling stepped into the pristine space, tracking street dirt onto the polished wood. Desmond loomed behind him, casting a long, ominous shadow across the room. The cigar smoke immediately violated the clean air of the studio. Bruce did not flinch. He did not move. He stood perfectly still, his hands resting lightly at his sides, observing the intruders with the dispassionate curiosity of a scientist looking at a predictable chemical reaction. "Which one of you is the actor, and which one is the stunt man?" Victor mocked, his voice a gravelly sneer. He took a deliberate drag of his cigar, letting the ash fall disrespectfully onto the matted floor. He knew exactly who Bruce was, but the disrespect was a calculated opening move. James Coburn tightened his grip on his towel, taking a half step forward. "This is a private studio. You boys are lost." Victor didn't even look at Coburn. "Shut up, Hollywood. I'm here for the Chinaman." He locked eyes with Bruce. "You're Lee, the guy who thinks he's a tough guy because he can break a piece of pine wood on television." Bruce's expression remained entirely neutral. He slowly walked forward, the grace of his movement so subtle it barely looked like walking. It was gliding. "You are making a mess on my floor," Bruce said, his voice calm, polite, and completely devoid of fear. "I ask that you leave. Now." Victor laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Or what? You gonna hit me with a karate chop?" Victor unbuttoned his suit jacket, casually sweeping it back to rest his hand near his hip, intentionally revealing the leather holster and the steel grip of his revolver. "Here's how this works, Lee. You operate in my town, you pay the tax. 30% of whatever these rich actors pay you goes to me. You refuse, and my friend Desmond, here, is going to introduce your spine to that mirror over there. And then we're going to pay a visit to your lovely home." It was the mention of the home, the veiled threat to Bruce's family, that shifted the atmosphere in the room. The temperature seemed to plummet. Coburn later described the moment as feeling like all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room by a sudden vacuum. Bruce did not get angry. His stillness simply crystallized. The tension in the room stretched to its absolute breaking point. Victor Sterling stood with a smug, self-satisfied grin, fully believing that his firearm and his giant enforcer granted him absolute dominance. In his world, fear was a mathematical equation. Gun plus muscle equals compliance. But he had fundamentally miscalculated the variable standing across from him. "I do not pay extortion," Bruce stated softly, "and you have made a very grave mistake bringing violence into my house." "Tough words for a guy wearing slippers," Victor sneered. He took a step closer, intentionally invading Bruce's personal space to assert physical dominance. It was an old street intimidation tactic. Get close, smell their fear, make them back down, or force them to swing first out of panic. Desmond, sensing the escalation, shifted his weight. The massive ex-boxer moved into Bruce's peripheral vision, effectively flanking the martial artist. Desmond's right hand slipped into his pocket, wrapping around the handle of a heavy brass knuckle duster. Bruce's eyes remained softly focused on Victor's chest. In the philosophy of Jeet Kune Do, you do not watch the opponent's eyes, nor do you watch their fists. You watch the center, the core. Every movement, every intent to strike originates from the center of mass. Bruce was reading Victor's micro-expressions, his breathing, the slight shift in his shoulders. "I'm going to count to 3, Lee," Victor barked, growing irritated by Bruce's unnatural calm. It unnerved him. "If you don't agree to the terms by 3, Desmond is going to break both of your kneecaps. 1. James Coburn, realizing the deadly seriousness of the situation, reached for a heavy wooden training staff resting against the wall. Bruce, without breaking his gaze from Victor, subtly raised a single finger, silently commanding Coburn to stand down. 2, Victor growled. He made his critical error. He reached out with his left hand, intending to grab Bruce by the lapels of his shirt, to physically shake him, to violently jerk the compliance out of him. It was an act of aggression. To Bruce, it was a telegraph. What happened next occurred in a span of exactly 3 seconds. To Victor Sterling, it felt like a blur of sheer kinetic terror. To James Coburn, watching from the sidelines, it was a masterclass in biomechanical perfection, a violent symphony executed at blinding speed. Second one, the interception. Victor's hand never reached Bruce's shirt. Bruce did not block the incoming grab. Blocking is a defensive reaction that wastes time. Instead, he employed Lin Sil Di Da, simultaneous defense and attack. Bruce's left hand shot up, trapping Victor's extending arm at the wrist, pulling the gangster slightly off balance and completely exposing his center line. At the exact same millisecond, recognizing that Desmond was the immediate lethal physical threat due to his size and flanking position, Bruce pivoted violently. His right leg snapped out in a low, devastating Jeet Tech intercepting kick that struck Desmond perfectly on the lateral aspect of his lead knee. A sickening crack echoed through the studio. Desmond's 250-pound frame instantly crumpled as his knee joint gave way, completely neutralizing the giant before he could even pull his brass knuckles from his pocket. Second 2, the dismantling. Without pausing, Bruce used the kinetic energy from the pivot and the kick to snap his attention back to Victor. Victor was still registering the sudden, jarring pull on his left arm and the horrifying sound of his bodyguard collapsing. The gangster's brain sent a panicked signal to his right hand, urging him to reach for his revolver. He was entirely too slow. Bruce's right hand, chambered near his waist, exploded forward. This was the legendary 1-inch punch mechanism, amplified by the rotational force of his hips. It bypassed Victor's frantic attempt to draw his weapon. The strike landed precisely on Victor's solar plexus. The impact was catastrophic. Victor's eyes bugged out of his head as all the air was violently forced from his lungs. His diaphragm paralyzed instantly. The sheer concussive force lifted the gangster's heels off the floor. Second 3, the conclusion. As Victor began to crumple forward, gasping silently like a fish on a dock, his hand instinctively fumbled away from his gun to clutch his chest. Bruce, flowing like water around a stone, secured Victor's right arm. With a sharp, twisting lever motion, an application of chin-na, Bruce locked the gangster's elbow, forcing Victor to plummet face first onto the matted floor to prevent his arm from snapping in half. The heavy revolver dislodged from the holster and skittered across the wooden floor, coming to a rest at James Coburn's feet. Silence slammed back into the room. The entire sequence had taken 3 seconds. The invincible Victor Sterling was pinned against the floor, whimpering, his arm locked in excruciating pain, completely at the mercy of the man he had called a dancer. A few feet away, the massive Desmond writhed in agony, clutching his ruined knee. Bruce Lee had not broken a sweat. His breathing remained remarkably even. He looked down at the gangster, trapped beneath his grip. "You counted to 2, Bruce whispered, leaning in close so only Victor could hear. "You forgot 3. Victor squeezed his eyes shut, anticipating the snap of his arm or a crushing blow to the back of his neck. His tough guy persona had completely evaporated, replaced by the primal, desperate terror of a man who realized he had stepped into the cage with a completely different species of predator. "Please," Victor wheezed out, his voice a pathetic squeak as he struggled for oxygen. "Please, my arm." Bruce released the pressure on the joint, stepping back gracefully. He did not kick the downed man. He did not gloat. He looked at the gangster with an expression of profound pity. "Pick up your trash," Bruce said, gesturing toward the groaning Desmond, "and never return to my city." The drive back to the San Fernando Valley was suffocatingly quiet. Inside the black Lincoln Continental, the usual bravado that accompanied Victor Sterling's crew was entirely absent. Desmond Hayes, the hulking enforcer who had instilled terror in countless victims, was slumped in the passenger seat, his face a sickening shade of grey. He clutched his rapidly swelling knee, biting down on a leather wallet to stifle his agonized groans every time the heavy car hit a bump in the asphalt. Victor drove with a white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel. His chest throbbed with a dull, radiating pain where Bruce Lee's 1-inch strike had paralyzed his diaphragm. Every shallow breath felt like inhaling broken glass. But the physical pain was secondary to the profound psychological shock. He had walked into that studio as a predator and had been dismantled with the casual efficiency of a man swatting a nuisance fly. The 3 seconds played on an agonizing loop in Victor's mind. It wasn't just the speed. It was the absolute absence of emotion in Bruce's eyes. There was no anger, no fear, no desperate adrenaline. It was pure, terrifying mechanics. "Pull over," Desmond choked out, spitting the leather wallet onto the floorboard. "Victor, pull the damn car over. I need a hospital. Something's torn inside." Victor ignored him, his jaw set so tight, his teeth ground together. He wasn't going to a hospital. A hospital meant police questions. A hospital meant the underworld would find out that Victor Sterling, the feared fixer, and his giant had been crippled by an unarmed man half their size. Instead, Victor steered the Lincoln toward an upscale, quiet neighborhood in Sherman Oaks. He pulled up to a sprawling, Spanish-style estate. This was the home of Arthur Pendleton, the traditional martial arts instructor who had orchestrated the hit. Arthur had promised Victor that Bruce Lee was a fraud, a pampered actor who relied on camera tricks and compliant students to look tough. Arthur had lied, and Victor was going to make him pay for that lie. Inside his lavish home, Arthur Pendleton was pouring himself a glass of expensive scotch, celebrating what he assumed was an inevitable victory. He envisioned Bruce Lee's studio in ruins, the charismatic upstart fleeing back to Hong Kong, leaving the lucrative Hollywood clientele right back in Arthur's lap. The heavy oak front door didn't ring. It shuddered under a massive impact. Before Arthur could set his glass down, the door was kicked open, the lock splintering into the foyer. Victor stepped inside, his tailored suit rumpled and stained with sweat and studio dust. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and feral. He looked less like a mafia enforcer and more like a man who had just survived a shipwreck. "Victor?" Arthur stammered, spilling the scotch over his expensive rug. "What the hell are you doing? I told you to call me from a payphone when the job was done. Where is Desmond?" Victor didn't speak. He crossed the room in 3 heavy strides, his right hand shooting out to grab Arthur by the throat. The gangster slammed the martial arts instructor against the mahogany bookshelf, rattling the antique vases. "You set us up," Victor hissed, his voice trembling with a mix of fury and lingering adrenaline. He squeezed Arthur's throat, cutting off his air. "You told me he was a dancer. You told me it was easy money." Arthur clawed desperately at Victor's thick fingers, his face turning a mottled purple. I didn't." Desmond is in the car, Victor snarled, leaning in so close Arthur could smell the stale cigar smoke and fear sweat. His leg is destroyed. A single kick, Arthur, before he could even blink. Then Lee put me on the floor so fast I didn't even see his hand move. He didn't just beat us, Arthur. He let us live because we were a joke to him. Victor released his grip, letting Arthur collapse onto the floor, gasping and coughing for air. "The contract is cancelled," Victor stated, straightening his ruined jacket. "But you still owe me the 10,000, and you're going to pay for Desmond's medical bills, every single cent. Because if you don't, I won't send Desmond next time. I'll come back myself, and I will introduce you to the same floor you tried to introduce Bruce Lee to." Arthur, trembling on the floor, looked up in absolute horror. The empire he had tried to protect by using underground thugs was crumbling around him. The realization washed over him like ice water. Bruce Lee was not a myth manufactured by Hollywood. The myth was real. Victor turned and walked out, leaving the front door hanging off its hinges. As the Lincoln drove away into the night, Arthur Pendleton knew his career in Los Angeles was effectively over. Back in the Culver City studio, the heavy, suffocating silence had returned, but the fundamental atmosphere of the room had been irrevocably altered. The lingering, acrid scent of Victor Sterling's cheap cigar smoke hung in the air, a harsh and unnatural invader in a space usually defined by the scent of sweat, canvas, and polished wood. It was the only remaining evidence that brutal, uncompromising violence had just intruded upon their sanctuary. James Coburn stood frozen near the mirrored wall, his broad shoulders pressed flat against the glass. He was staring intensely at the empty space on the matted floor where Victor and the massive Desmond had been crumpled just moments before. The acclaimed actor had made a highly successful career out of playing rugged, dangerous men on the silver screen. He had drawn prop firearms in countless westerns and executed meticulously choreographed brawls under the bright studio lights. But what he had just witnessed was stripped of all cinematic glamour. It was real, terrifying, and breathtakingly absolute. The sudden realization of his own fragility in the face of genuine underworld malice left him entirely pale. Slowly, as if moving underwater, James stepped forward and bent down to retrieve the heavy revolver Victor had left behind. He picked it up gingerly by the cylinder, avoiding the trigger. The weapon felt dense, oily, and intensely ugly in his hands, a crude instrument of death that had been entirely neutralized by a man using nothing but his bare hands and profound anatomical understanding. I'll lock this in the safe," James said, his voice unusually quiet, stripped of its trademark resonant confidence. He looked up at Bruce, fully expecting to see the telltale signs of a massive adrenaline dump: trembling hands, dilated pupils, or at least a deep, shuddering breath of relief. Instead, Bruce Lee was quietly bending over, picking up the leather focus mitts that had been dropped during the sudden confrontation. He walked over to his custom-built wooden dummy, his breathing perfectly regulated, his expression as serene as a calm sea. He methodically aligned the mitts on a nearby bench, seemingly more concerned with the tidiness of his studio than the fact that he had just crippled a mob enforcer. "Bruce," James finally said, the sheer weight of his awe and disbelief breaking through his shock. I've never seen anything like that. You dismantled 2 armed men in 3 seconds. You didn't even blink." Bruce turned to his student, his dark eyes soft. He offered a gentle, almost apologetic smile, devoid of any ego or boastfulness. "I did not dismantle them, James. Their own aggression dismantled them. I merely provided the wall they crashed into." James walked over, carefully setting the heavy revolver down on a side table, wanting to put as much distance between himself and the firearm as possible. He rubbed the back of his neck, trying to process the impossible physics of the encounter. But the speed, the sheer timing of it all. You knew exactly what the big guy was going to do before he even did it. How is that possible? He was standing practically behind you. Bruce motioned for James to sit with him on the matted floor. It was a teaching moment, far more profound and vital than any standard physical lesson they had planned for the afternoon. James immediately sat cross-legged, hanging on to every word. Remember what we were discussing just before the door opened? Anticipation versus flow, Bruce explained, his tone conversational and even. The man in the suit, Victor, he was loud. He projected his intent through his words, his aggressive posture, his sheer arrogance. He was acting out a scene he had already rehearsed in his mind, expecting us to play the roles of the terrified victims. But the quiet one, Desmond, he was the actual weapon in the room. When Victor moved to grab my shirt, it was merely a distraction, an anchor. I could feel the shift in the room. Desmond dropped his right shoulder. He shifted his substantial weight entirely to his back leg to generate the necessary torque for a devastating swing. Bruce tapped his own temple lightly with 2 fingers. In Jeet Kune Do, we do not fight the weapon itself. We fight the intent behind it. By the time Desmond consciously thought about swinging his brass knuckles, his intent had already traveled through his nervous system, tensed his muscles, and shifted his hips. I did not intercept his fist, James. I intercepted his thought. James shook his head in sheer amazement, replaying the blinding flash of Bruce's low kick in his mind. And Victor? You had his arm completely locked. I saw his face. You could have snapped the bone in half with a flick of your wrist. You had him dead to rights after he threatened your family. Bruce looked down at his own hands, resting them lightly on his knees. Violence, Bruce said softly, the weight of his philosophy anchoring the words, is sometimes necessary for preservation. If you are backed into a corner, you must strike with absolute conviction. But cruelty is a poison. It corrodes the spirit of the martial artist. He looked back up, meeting James's eyes directly. If I had broken his arm while he was already defeated, I would have been operating out of vengeance and anger. I would have allowed a man like him to dictate my emotional state. By controlling him without destroying him, I proved to him that his entire way of life, the intimidation, the fear, the reliance on brute force, is ultimately fragile and hollow. Bruce stood up in one fluid, graceful motion, picking up the leather focus mitts once more. He tossed one lightly to James, who scrambled up from the mat to catch it. The world outside this studio is chaotic, James, Bruce said, walking back to the center of the training mat, his posture perfect, his spirit completely unburdened. Men will always try to intimidate you, to take what is rightfully yours, to forcefully prove their own worth by diminishing yours. You cannot control the Victor Sterlings of the world, but you can control the water within you. When they strike, ensure you are not there. When they fall, you must be the rock beneath them. James smiled, finally feeling the icy tension completely leave his shoulders. The lingering fear of the gangsters had evaporated, replaced by a profound, life-altering respect for the philosopher standing across from him. He slipped the leather mitt onto his hand, feeling a renewed surge of energy. "All right, Bruce," James said, dropping into a balanced stance. "Show me the intercepting kick again. I think I finally understand what you mean by flow." In the weeks and months that followed, the story of the 3-second dismantling spread through the Los Angeles underground in hushed, terrified whispers. The absolute efficiency of the violence served as an ironclad deterrent. Victor Sterling never set foot in Culver City again, his reputation shattered, Arthur Pendleton, paralyzed by the realization of what he had unleashed, quietly closed his traditional dojo a month later, citing vague, personal reasons, and faded entirely into obscurity. Bruce Lee never once spoke of the incident to the press, nor did he boast about it to his other celebrity clients. He didn't need to. The event became a silent, unshakable pillar of his legacy, proving to the world, and to the dangerous shadows that foolishly sought to test him, that the dragon was very, very real. The encounter in Culver City remained a whispered legend, a testament to a man who transcended the silver screen. Bruce Lee didn't just perform martial arts, he lived them with unyielding truth. Victor Sterling learned that true power isn't found in a loaded gun, but in the disciplined stillness of the mind. 3 seconds of violence forged an eternity of respect, echoing through the annals of martial arts history.